and welcome to the January membership meeting of the Central Minnesota chapter of the Climate Reality Project. On January 11th, Bill Middlecamp from our own Central Minnesota chapter presentation team gave us a demonstration on the operation and capabilities of the online En-ROADS tool. En-ROADS is a global climate simulator that allows users to explore the impact that dozens of policies, such as electrifying transport, pricing carbon, and improving agricultural practices, have on hundreds of factors like energy prices, temperature, air quality, and sea level rise. As an official trained En-ROADS ambassador, Bill has led multiple discussion groups through the use of the tool and how it can be used to facilitate real discussion on the potential solutions to climate change, breaking through the flurry of research and data points to find those solutions that both quickly address rising CO2 emissions and stand a chance of being implemented into public policy. Let's listen to the details.
I'm glad to see you all here. This is a great audience, and I'm excited about what we're going to discuss tonight. So first of all, En-ROADS is a global system dynamics simulator. Now, what is that? The Wikipedia definition for that is an approach to understanding nonlinear behavior of complex systems over time using stocks, flows, internal feedback loops, table functions, and time delays. In simpler words, it's like a great big spreadsheet. If you've ever done a spreadsheet where you tie the cells together so that you change one and a whole bunch of things happen, that's what this is. That's what this technology is. And it's not been invented just for this. It is a proven technology that's used for a lot of different things. And they're taking off-the-shelf software to implement this model, but they're putting a ton of science into it. And it is truly impressive to see all the different ways they're accounting for the interactions between things. So you'll see some of those relationships, but you'll see, in fact, that some things have an impact on GDP. And some things have an impact on, the interactions are just amazing. And they're all calculated instantaneously so that you can play what-if scenarios with this thing. So what does the En-ROADS model do? It represents key processes in the energy system and its connections to climate, economy, and environment for a single global region. Now that's important. This is a global model. So it assumes that we are applying the policies that we'll be discussing tonight across the whole world. We know that's not true, but at least it helps us validate which technologies are effective, and it helps people correct the assumptions they might have. It's hard when you think about all the research you've ever heard about. You're going to simulate a small portion of that, and you can really get to a deep understanding on even less, right? So when you talk to somebody, they typically have something that they kind of have latched onto, and that's where their expertise is, and they like to talk about that. And if the conversation goes outside of their area of experience, it can be challenging for them to feel like they're part of it. Well, this tool allows them to rely on all that experience and knowledge from all the research that's being done, tons of research that's being done outside of this model that's incorporated into this model. So you can feel confident that you're speaking with some truth, and then you can play these what-if scenarios with the model. So it's calibrated to a suite of integrated assessment models as opposed to dynamic simulations or system dynamic simulations. These are the heavy lifting models that basically produce the information we have about what's really going on in the world. And it's based on a web browser. It only works on computers. It requires too much resources for phones or iPads or that sort of thing. But it's free. Anybody can access it on the internet. It's in, a couple dozen different languages, so it's global. It instantly computes more than 10,000 equations, solving differential equations to predict the outcome of these different solutions. It has a pretty intuitive interface, so it's easy to learn how to operate it, but it's just got a ton of science behind it, and that's where the challenge comes in. But you as individuals, everybody, can try your own experiments and get immediate feedback. So En-ROADS helps users think about the dynamics of capital stock turnover, growth, energy intensity, and carbon intensity, implications of technological lock-in for particular technologies, effective combinations of supply side versus demand side, or technology-driven versus incentive-driven policies, as well as their side effects, the scale of socioeconomic and emissions changes required to meet climate goals. So, I mean, a lot of those are words that probably go right over. You have to think about them for a while to know what they really mean, but I just included them here. This comes directly out of the documentation from En-ROADS. I include them here just to show you how broad, how comprehensive this tool really is. So first of all, it's educational to work with this tool. And typically the situation is I, as a leader, what's called an ambassador, who've developed a lower level of experience or a higher level of experience, a lower depth of experience, greater depth of experience. I can lead a group, but then everybody can throw out their ideas. You know, I think this is going to be the great solution, or I don't have confidence in that solution. And then we can experiment with it, see what happens according to the model. And then the really interesting part comes in trying to figure out why it turned out that way. And that's where I play an important role. Even though it's got all this stuff built into it, it is still very tunable. It's very easy to see how it does what it does. They're totally open, totally transparent. It's easy to access the information that tells you how they're making their calculations and what assumptions they've made. They typically are very conservative. They look at all these different models, and of course the models diverge. No one model is correct. And they try to be kind of in the middle of it. They want to avoid what is called magical thinking, where you think, oh, geez, I know that, you know, algae can be turned into oil, right? Where, you know, we heard about ExxonMobil touting this future where we were going to get away from fossil fuels because they're going to make oil from algae. And, you know, that went on with a lot of magical thinking for almost 2 decades. And then it's just like, it's off the table. So they try to avoid that. They try to avoid hyperbole. They try to avoid this so-called magical thinking. I like to think of this as, you know, with all that technology built in, all that knowledge built in, for me, it's like a pocket calculator. It's a quick reference. When I think I know something, I can check it out in En-ROADS and maybe correct my assumptions and learn something new. They're constantly upgrading it. They've got quite a team of people with, like I said, a very broad, deep understanding of the sciences, deep understanding of the technologies they're using. It includes not just climate science, but also economics. So there's, you know, well-accepted business practices that are built into this so that, again, we know that the answers it gives have some reality. And some of the recent additions that they've put in here is this economic damage function. Now, what's interesting about this is it says that, or we know, it's already happening, that climate change lowers GDP. Think about that for a second. Climate change, you know, oftentimes you'll hear people talk about how addressing climate change is going to wreck the economy. Well, not addressing climate change wrecks the economy. Loss of range of habitat. What effect is it having on animals, and how does that impact climate change? It assumes for the first time a status quo carbon price of $5. Now, there are many places around the world, about a quarter of the world actually has implemented carbon fee, carbon tax, if you will. And when you average that across the globe, it ends up being about $5. The percentage of food from animals and the amount of food we waste. Again, these are things that factor in to our impact as humans on the environment. And they added this user guide to make it easier. They used to point to a humongous PDF file. Now it's built in, it's online, and you can easily access that information. So the basic tool, and I'm going to show you the picture of that in a moment, but it has all these knobs you can control. So you can adjust policies that governments might implement and see what effects they have. And then it has just a huge amount of outputs. They're in graphical form, but you can also go in and you can look at the individual data points that make up the graph. You can actually download the graph data as a spreadsheet and then do your own deeper analysis on it if you like. Um, it's based on experiences, okay? So the audience participates. You throw out an idea, I want to find out what'll happen if we incentivize the heck out of renewable energy. What will that do? How much of an effect will that have on solving the problem of climate change? And then, as I explained to you, as an ambassador, it's my job to help the audience understand. Of course, I operate the tool for efficiency, but anybody could operate the tool. But then, when we have questions about what could be the reasons behind this, that's where I try to explain what I've learned, or maybe help the group as a whole go off and do their own research to figure out why is it happening the way it happens. So it comes out of MIT Sloan School of Management, and there are a lot of different benefactors that are supporting this work, and it's getting a lot of attention. And there's this quote from John Kerry saying that he thinks it's a great tool, and I agree. So the science, let's talk a little bit about the science. It's a global model. It focuses on how changes in the energy, economic, and public policy systems could affect greenhouse gas emissions and climate outcomes. It actually it runs from 2000 to 2100. It's a 100-year window. But they started the model in 1990. They just run the clock back, run it for 20 plus years of reality, and compare the models that they're depending on, where they've parameterized these models so that they can use them in the simulator. They compare that with the reality. They compare those 30 years with the reality. And if it's a good fit, then they can feel somewhat confident that the predictions going forward are going to be a good answer, a reasonable answer. En-ROADS is powered by more than 14,000 or about 14,000 equations that provide output in 60 milliseconds with a time step of 45 days across the time range. So that's a little technology behind the scenes. There's an extensive study of the literature of important factors such as delay times, progress ratios, price sensitivities, historical growth of energy sources, and energy efficiency potential. It's really kind of jumping into the deep end of the pool to try and understand all the science that has gone into this. To improve the model, as this is what I described, they compare the results against what has actually happened in the real world for the last 30 years. Since primary energy demand, carbon dioxide concentration, temperature, and other values have been measured over the years, we can compare what the model produces from 1990 to 2020 with its equations to the real world data and see if they are similar. If the behavior of these variables in En-ROADS matches historical data well, that gives us some confidence that using the same equations could describe what might happen in the future. But there are some criticisms of the model and areas where they could improve, they might improve, or sometimes it's out of the realm of possibility. But first of all, we know that all models are imperfect. And the fundamental reason for this is you can't model human behavior, and human behavior affects where climate change will go. Okay? So everything is based on status quo. Just take the way we've been doing things and assume people are just going to keep doing things the same way, except for these policy changes that you are experimenting with. And then you figure out, okay, given status quo, how do we differ from status quo? It does not include or capture some important feedbacks, such as climate change is already harming human welfare and capital stocks, slowing GDP and shortening lives. The global model assumes uniform policies across the world, and we know that countries' responses differ. They already do, they will in the future. And it doesn't do much of a job of tipping points. Now, for example, what happens if the permafrost melts? There's a big discontinuity at that point, and we see things change in a dramatic way. We recently, actually a few days ago, I heard about what may be a tipping point. There was a sharp decline in the ice around Antarctica, and it's middle of winter down there, so this should be their maximum ice. It deviates from the norm by 4 standard deviations. Now, normally when we talk about the bell curve and normal distributions, we only talk about 3 standard deviations because 99.7% of all data falls within 3 standard deviations. So it's actually a little hard for me to dig in and find out just how rare is the 4th standard deviation and what does it imply? What kind of a frequency does that imply? And the best I could tell, it was like a 1 in 1,000-year event to have that level of ice, that minimum. So let's have a session. This is what the tool looks like, and I'm going to jump to that right now. I'm going to restart the simulation because I was playing around with it a little bit. You said graphs, return to default graphs. Okay, what you see here is over on the left, there's a bunch of energy supply controls. We have 8 different supplies. What if we put a heavy tax on coal? You'd slide that all the way to the left. Or what if we incentivize coal? You'd slide that to the right. Same with oil, natural gas. Those are the fossil fuels that generate carbon dioxide when we burn them. And bioenergy, which is supposedly, carbon neutral, because we grow plants, we turn them into energy. As they grow, they take carbon dioxide out of the air, and as we consume them, they put carbon dioxide back into the air. So what about bioenergy? That's a control. Renewables, wind and solar, and possibly some others. Then nuclear energy, it has its own. And this new zero carbon could be fusion. If we somehow make a breakthrough where we can actually generate usable amounts of energy from fusion and harvest that into making electricity, that could have an impact on climate change. It might also include naturally forming hydrogen. That's a relatively new thing that society didn't really know about, but it's been discovered that there are deposits, and actually they're not really deposits. It's more of a generation of through chemical processes deep in the earth, it's the generation of nearly pure hydrogen. That could be a source if we figure out where to find that and can harvest it. And then finally, although it's not an energy source itself, carbon price has an impact, obviously, on fossil fuel consumption. Then in the middle, we have uses of energy, okay? We've got transportation, cars, trucks, buses, boats, planes, trains, all different kinds of transportation. We could make it more efficient, and we can electrify it. So we've got 2 knobs for transportation. Buildings and industry, this includes our residences, includes our office buildings. It also includes our factories and our industrial processes, like making cement or steel or whatever we're manufacturing. Those all go into this category. And again, we can make them more energy efficient and we can electrify them. And then this bottom one is not a use per se, but population. What happens if we have more people in the world? What happens if we have fewer people in the world? And economic growth. What if we increase economic growth? Well, we all know that means we're going to, use a lot more energy and we're going to produce a lot more carbon dioxide. What if we slow down economic growth? How does that affect the outcome? Then over here, we've got sort of a miscellaneous area. We have the methane and so-called F gases, the manufactured gases that are used for things like solvents and refrigerants and other uses of manufactured gases. They are F gases because they typically have fluorine in them. They have a humongous climate change impact on a per molecule basis. Methane also, we know, has an outsized influence compared to carbon dioxide. So that gets its own category of something we should try to control. Then there's deforestation and land degradation, cutting down trees, converting the Amazon into fields to grow crops, to raise more livestock, whatever. If we cut down on deforestation, or if we do even more deforestation, how does that happen? How does that affect the outcome? Afforestation, the planting of trees. The idea that Trump touted of planting 1 trillion trees, wouldn't that solve the problem? Well, we can play with that here. But it also includes other environmental things, other agricultural kinds of things that we can do to change how we use land and how that might affect climate change. And then technological is carbon capture and storage, or other ways of actually taking carbon dioxide out of the air. When we change these, we start to change these graphs up top. Now on the upper left is where we get our energy. The brown is coal, red is oil, the blue is natural gas or methane. Green is renewable energy, wind and solar. The whatever that color is, I'm not very good at naming colors, but it's pink or chartreuse or whatever. That's bioenergy. There is a sliver here for nuclear, and then new zero, because it's not producing anything today. It doesn't show up on here, but it could if we had that, and we can simulate that. Now, what you see here is I'm showing you as I hover over the different areas of the graph, I can see how much of the graph that particular part accounts for. So in the year 2100, what we see given status quo is that we'll get about 15.8 exajoules of energy per year from nuclear energy. And we will get about 380 exajoules of energy from renewable energy, given status quo. Then over on the right, what we see is sort of the outputs of the calculations. And in this case, we're looking at greenhouse gas net emissions. I'm just going to quickly show you all the different kinds of charts that are available. These are the categories, and each category has many different graphs within it. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at the information coming out. And similarly, over on this side, we have lots of different sort of input kinds of variables that we can look at. Okay, what about futzing with the economy, financial things, population, GDP, carbon removal technologies of a variety of types. And so we can answer all kinds of questions that way. And then over here, again, on the right, what we see is a black line. That black line represents status quo. The blue line, when we make a policy change, we can then see how that deviates from the status quo. So if it helps, it's going to drop that blue line. If it hurts, it's going to raise the blue line. And in addition to seeing the quantity of change, we also see the timing of change. You can see here the timeline over the century. And that's an important thing to pay attention to as well. Because if we have a great idea like new zero carbon, but it doesn't come online until 2060, it's important to see what effect that has on the outcome. Now over here on the far right, we see temperature, a prediction for the temperature at the end of the century. It's in centigrade and in Fahrenheit here. And we'll see again what kind of an effect we might have if we change policies. What's interesting about this 3.3 is when I started using this tool, it was 3.6 degrees, and it's already been brought down to 3.3 degrees. Now, there are two reasons for that. One is this effect of climate change on the economy, reducing GDP, reducing the consumption of fossil fuels, and in effect, lowering the outcome at the end of the century. That accounts for 0.2 of a degree. Then there's 0.1 of a degree that is because we've actually made progress. We're seeing a lot more renewable energy. We're seeing a lot more policies toward reducing climate gases, greenhouse gases. So a couple other things here. There's a quick way to look at a variety of graphs and switch between them. So we might do a little bit of that. And one of the ones that I find particularly interesting is the temperature change graph. This graph also has these dotted lines, these gray dotted lines. The lower one is the 1.5 degrees C of warming. And you can see we're basically already there. 2022, 24. It's very sensitive. We're at 1.35 degrees of global warming already. All right. Obviously, any change we make is not going to affect the blue line going to the left of 2024 because we can't change the past. But hopefully, we'll see dramatic changes going to the right. So to begin with, normally I have some canned sliders. I will pick a few things to make a point, and then I'll just go through them quickly. But since this is a group that's so engaged, I would like to now just sort of start experimenting. This is the end of the monologue, and now you all get a chance to participate. So if you would, please put in the chat a technology or a policy that you have the least confidence is going to solve the problem. The least confidence that it's going to solve the problem. Afforestation, the planting of trees. Thank you, Anna. Tim, also, planting of trees, low impact. Magical thinking. Gary, looks like everybody wants to look at, okay, carbon capture, CCS, carbon capture and sequestration. Thank you, Tim. And I'm going to play with this afforestation model here. Now, what do you think is going to happen? Go ahead and come off of mute and just give some ideas what you think is going to happen when we play with afforestation.
A delayed response will take a long time for much effect, and eventually they'll decay and go back into the air.
Okay, two very good points. It takes a while for them to do the job, and they don't keep doing it forever.
Yeah, just a very small effect.
Very small effect. So let's go ahead and move that just a little bit here. And I'm not seeing anything yet. A little bit more. A little bit more. Oh, I think I'm starting to see the blue line just slightly start to bend at the very end. Let's put out a medium growth. It's not having an effect until well into 2050s here. It starts to divert a little bit somewhere around here. Let's go ahead and push that out to the maximum. All right. What we see is 1/10 of a degree C by the end of the century. Let's take a look at how that affects the carbon dioxide concentration. All right. Parts per million, we all know we've passed 400. We're at 420 parts per million now. And by the end of the century, we see a difference, 602 and a half or 631, 632. So we see a difference of 30 parts per million by planting as many trees as we can possibly plant. And what we find is that, first of all, it's difficult to get land. You've got to incentivize or buy land to plant trees, or incentivize farmers to plant trees instead of crops. Has to make financial sense to them, economic sense. And then they have to keep them there. It doesn't do any good if they plant them for a few years and then cut them down, and get a credit and then cut them down. So we actually do not see much of an impact until 2050. So it's like 20 years out, maybe 30 years out, because small trees don't take in much. They take a while to grow big enough to start having an impact. And then although the time frame is too short for this, what Tim said is actually true. Eventually they reach equilibrium, and then they die and they decay and they release the carbon and new trees grow. So you can't just keep burning fossil fuels and think you're going to be able to plant more and more and more and more trees. It just doesn't work that way, all right? But along with that, what if we're cutting down fewer trees? Let's watch as we move this. We're seeing a much more significant effect in terms of the divergence from the status quo. And I'm going to get rid of the afforestation so we can get a better sense of where that has an impact. Again, we don't see much of a difference until 2040. Now, here's another thing that's real interesting. If you aren't sure what this means, you can click on these 3 dots over here, and it describes it's the decrease or increase of the amount of forests to decrease or increase the amount of forests and make changes to global food and agricultural choices. The main driver of deforestation is the need for cropland, which results in the permanent removal of forests. If the demand for additional cropland is avoided as a result of less food from animals, less food waste, or better crop yield, then deforestation can be significantly reduced. Forest degradation is the temporary loss of forests due to harvesting for wood products for bioenergy. Now that's an interesting word to include here, bioenergy. Maybe we want to go look at that and see, okay, is that really the panacea that we hope it is? People are talking about using bioenergy as fuel for airplanes and ships and maybe trains, things that are difficult to electrify. And then you'll see here some of the settings that we can control. If we want to go under the covers and do something different from what the experts have recommended, then we can play with that. But, you know, when we go in here and start doing that kind of stuff, we have to be careful, again, not to get into magical thinking. These assumptions that are built in are based on serious research and serious consideration by academics. All right, let's take a look at carbon capture and sequestration. Now that's going to be under this technological slider over here. Carbon dioxide removal technologies pull carbon out of the atmosphere by manually sequestering and storing carbon or enhancing natural removals, including direct air capture, DACC, enhanced mineralization, you know, that's basically tricking the rocks into absorbing more carbon dioxide that they would naturally absorb. Agricultural soil carbon, sometimes you know, tilling practices can change that, because as we turn the soil over, we open it up and oxidize the carbon that's stored in the soil. Biochar, which is a relatively new and a little bit controversial technology, and carbon dioxide removal approaches face significant barriers to scale up and deployment. So I'm going to play around with the graphs here, and I believe there's a graph here for maybe it's this one. Yes, here we go. So we can remove carbon dioxide by planting trees, as we discussed, by bioenergy, carbon capture and sequestration, direct air capture and carbon sequestration, mineralization, the rocks, agricultural soil carbon, and biochar. So if we play with afforestation, that's where we can see carbon dioxide removal, and this is not by year, this is accumulated, right? So the amount per year, you'd have to look under the covers a little bit. 397.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Well, we're currently pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate of about 80 gigatons. So you can see how it doesn't solve the problem by itself. But let's see what happens if we do less land degradation. Let's go with this technological one. And there are the different kinds of technologies that we could use. Again, the numbers are not real big. Let's slide this afforestation on here again to overlay that. As you can see, just planting trees gets about 1/3 of the total, if we could do that. So these other technologies for carbon capture and sequestration, again, they're not enough. I mean, we're looking at 75 years, 1,200. That's 16, if I'm doing the math right. 160. No. 16 gigatons per year versus 80 gigatons. Trying to do math in my head, that's always a bad idea. So there's a couple of ideas we've explored. We know it's always good to plant trees, and we believe that we're going to need some technologies in order to reach true carbon neutrality and sustain that for the indefinite future. But we know that that's not a panacea. So let's see what else people put in the chat here. Bioenergy is also a bad deal. Thank you for that, Anna. What about effects of drought on afforestation? Very good question. We can't grow trees in the desert. Effects of possible future pipelines. Now, that's an interesting question. The pipelines are not a source of carbon dioxide in and of themselves, but they do contribute to the efficiency with which we consume fossil fuels, right?
Well, they would probably make fossil fuels cheaper, right? Because it's increased pipelines means that you got more fossil fuels, and then you use them.
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. The cheaper you make it, the more people will consume of it. It also creates an incentive for businesses to continue to promote because they've got a capital investment in that pipeline, and those things are expensive, and they've got a prediction for the return on revenue. So they're going to fight hard to maintain that, and they'll take it to court. Say, we made this investment, you can't destroy our investment. And some courts would rule in their favor. So pipelines can have an effect, but I don't know how I would model that here, except just to say that it would be a greater consumption of fossil fuels. So the world has to make rapid progress in reducing the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas, also methane, known as methane, reducing the atmospheric releases of methane, which is a greenhouse gas, strong greenhouse gas, and reducing deforestation and land degradation. Those 5 things are our priorities. So when we play with this tool, we want to look at how do we impact those things most. Actions are the antidote to anxiety. Steering toward high priority actions where people have confidence that they're going to have an impact is really paramount, okay? Normally, an En-ROAD session would go on for hours, all right? And I haven't yet had the opportunity to engage people for that amount of time to really play with this tool. But that's what, that's the potential of this tool, is to get people motivated to go and say, all right, I know this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to put a lot of my energy into it. Create experiences where people learn on their own terms. Showing research just doesn't work. People can't assimilate the information. It just kind of ends up as a gut feeling for them. And this experience of trying out their thoughts, putting them down and seeing what happens, that is far more empowering. We need to engage the world now to make rapid changes on those 5 priorities. And so we all have a role to play. And I'll just go back now to this. And I guess, that's the end of my talk. I wish I had 2 hours. I think this group would have a lot of fun exploring.
Say, Bill, could you give us a scenario where we would actually reduce the warming to like the 2 degrees Celsius, maybe increasing renewables, decreasing fossil fuels, more electrification?
You want to look at the answer in the back of the book.
Yeah, we're out of time.
So carbon price is a huge one. And we all ought to be fighting for a carbon tax or a carbon fee and dividend. Because what it does is it's not too disruptive. You start small and you grow. It naturally shifts the economic balance from fossil fuels being the most economical choice to fossil fuels being the worst economic choice. The money that's raised under many of the scenarios for that goes back to the citizens. It isn't kept by the government. So you get a check, regardless of how much fossil fuels you use or how much fossil fuels you avoid using, doesn't matter. Every citizen gets a check, right? And you can turn that around and you can use that in the marketplace. So if you make personal choices to lower your carbon consumption, you're going to be saving money because of that. And then you're going to be getting money, which then you can use for more things, right? So it allows people to make their own choices in the marketplace. It provides this natural, steadily increasing pressure, which is not too disruptive. So it can have a huge impact. All right, so that's number one. Then, of course, we want to make everything as efficient as we possibly can. And we want to electrify it because we can get electricity from anything. And we can choose to get electricity from clean sources. I'm not going to touch population or economic growth. Turns out that if you decarbonize society, they don't make a difference. Now, there's reasons to reduce population growth for other reasons, but you don't need to do that. We stop harming the environment. We plant trees as much as we can. We develop the technologies to help us deal with the carbon that we're always going to be burning and we can't seem to get out of society. And then we get our hands around, and you see here, we're almost to the point where the net greenhouse gas emissions are zero, neutral, or compared to historic. And we've actually brought the temperature very close to 1.6 C. And then we get a hold of these F gases and the methane, and now we can actually go carbon negative and start to draw down the carbon content of the atmosphere. Now, this is the greenhouse gas net emissions. So I'm going to go to, I'm just going to grab it here. This is faster. I'm going to go to the temperature chart here. And what you see is it's baked in that we're going to exceed 1.5. I think we're at 1.33 right now, actually. But we can actually turn that around and start coming down again. Remember, this lower gray dotted line is the 1.5 C. But we have to do these things right away. Look, we start to bend we bend the curve in start to see it in 2030, right? And a lot of the things we've been talking about is like, okay, we'll start doing these things by 2030, or we'll have the first tier of things in place by 2030. So I think what you're going to see is governments, when they put something out there for a little while, they're going to come back and they're going to strengthen it. And then they're going to strengthen it again. They have to. So hopefully we'll be able to do those ratcheting up fast enough to achieve this curve. But it's possible. That's the hopeful thing.
There's been a lot of talk that addressing methane early could buy us some time. Have you seen any scenarios that tackle that, or maybe something to experiment with?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Let's try that. Let's just reset everything and then go over and look at methane.
I don't want to be flip, Bill, but hopefully that methane reduction isn't predicated on changing cow diets, right? Cattle diets, and it's actually capturing the crap that they're pumping into the atmosphere.
So it does include enteric digestion, which produces methane. But there's a lot of methane that is leaked from wells and pipelines. My daughter lives in Boston, and shortly after she got married, I visited her at her new home. We got off the bus and stepped onto the street, and I said, "Oh, I smell gas, that mercaptan smell, right?" And I said, "I this is not good." And I went over to the sewer, and it's like I can smell it coming out of the sewer. And I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, we got a methane leak here. The city should know about it. And my daughter's going, "Stop it, Dad, stop it." And then finally, it turned out that the whole city smells like that because their infrastructure is so old that it's leaking natural gas all over the place. Now, what we can do is we can stop using natural gas. We can go with electricity for heating and cooking, and just, not have to go in and replace all that infrastructure, which is too expensive for a lot of people, and just faster technology change of switching to electrification, beneficial electrification. But yeah, you can see it is a pretty significant thing in terms of all the different ways we can address causes of climate change. It accounts for 0.4 of a degree C by itself. So yeah, it's a big one. But it is kind of a lot of different things, right? Like dealing with cows and dealing with leaky pipes and
will you try something right here at this point from this basis state, crank nuclear to the top, would you?
Nuclear. Now that's a very interesting subject. Okay. I have played with nuclear in lots of different ways. Okay, so let's put a heavy carbon price on, which is going to increase nuclear. But what you see here, and let's take this one off just so we aren't affected by that. Again, you don't see a major change until the mid-30s because it takes time. You know, all these new technologies that we're talking about with nuclear energy, I just heard just the other day that they've decided to take a step back because they found a more efficient way to run the nuclear reactors and get more energy out. And so they're going back for some re-review. All of a sudden, there's a couple years delay, right? And I think we're going to continue to see that. And then it's going to take a while for the electric companies to feel confident that they could invest in something like that. And it's just basic economic principles that it takes a long time for a new technology like that to come up to speed. But then after, 2060, you'd think that it would be pretty well in hand. And, here we are with 191 exajoules, and you get all the way out to the end of the century, and it's not a lot more. It's like 50% more exajoules. So why doesn't it grow and take over?
Well, that's what's underlying in the model, right? And who dials in those sensitivities for the differential equations that relate to the impact, right, of this term. That's what I don't know.
And what do you think they put in there?
Well, I imagine they include very long build-up times because of the anti-financial incentive due to the heavy capital cost and the extremely long ROI, right? So that the whole ROI thing basically modulates the impact because it's a slow growth, even though it may be maximized based on some ability to deliver machines. Then it's paced by regulatory certification overhead, which is extraordinarily long in this industry. And then it's the whole payback thing right on top of that and amplifies the whole damn thing. So, and it's not really new technology, right? Nuclear power is, right, one of the older mature technologies of the renewables, right? So it's kind of interesting how that works.
I don't want to get caught
on the side because I just wanted to see if there was an effect here that was worth.
But
you said there resonates with me, and that is, and if I boil it down to one word, it's expensive. Today, nuclear energy is the most expensive form of electricity we have. The promise of these new technologies is that it's going to get cheaper, but there's a bit of magical thinking in that. And this model tends to be conservative. So they're taking a more conservative view of how well they think nuclear is going to compete in the marketplace.
Well, and so to that point, my guess is that the nuclear power that's reflected in that turquoise line is basically presumed to be coming from large multi-gigawatt plants, 10, 20 gigawatt facilities like Prairie Island, right? Or that's not quite that big, but in that scale, Diablo Canyon, right, out in California, those kinds of things. It isn't accounting for SMR and baking in an upside that says, well, if we actually got our stuff together and manage the regulatory thing and let the engineering guys take the cost down like we do with every other technology, then we would see a different impact. And I'm sure that's not in this model. That might be an interesting, way to take it and perturb it a little bit. So
yeah, a couple of things real quick here. We are pretty much at the end. I will note that I looked at this model several years ago, and when you click on the ellipses, those three dots, it does break it down to how they did it, and there is a return on investment, and the difficulty of getting it approved was factored in there.
Thanks again to Bill Middlecamp for a great presentation on the En-ROADS Climate Simulator. If you're looking for further information, be sure to check out this link to try out the En-ROADS simulator for yourself. And be sure to join us next month for our February membership meeting, when we will hear from Dean Barone of the Texas Climate Reality Chapter. Dean will update us on the incentives of the Inflation Reduction Act for businesses and nonprofits. Further details will be published in the newsletter and on our website. And on behalf of the leadership team here at the Central Minnesota chapter of the Climate Reality Project, thanks for watching.